So this presentation is meant to supplement what was missing on Tuesday since I was unable to teach during zero period just a few days ago. If you notice, there are chapters and a jigsawing chapters, but I'm going to go ahead and not require those sections. We did our discussion of chapters 7 and 8 on Monday. And you can look at the book. It's actually on your iPad. It's a book entitled Thank You for Arguing. And it is a pretty easy read. It's sort of like Plato and the Platypus, and it sort of describes ways in which you can control a conversation using argumentative sort of rhetoric and the features of the way in which logic interacts with language when you want to describe something you believe. So it's an important book in that regard, but you can decide to choose specific chapters that interest you from the content, table of contents, or you can go with your team's jigsaw if you want to just read those couple of pages, just to get a feel for the book. It's not a lot of reading, and you could skim it if you want. Instead, I'm going to give you a basic overview of some of the key features of Thank You for Arguing. In part, I'm connecting it to informal fallacies, but I'm also trying to show that knowledge is based primarily on how language and how your use of language really does affect what you believe. And if you're able to describe something, sort of that knowledge by description, you're able to prove that you know something. And this is a form of reasoning, a form of evidence to a position. There are a couple of key terms that we need to get into first and foremost. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the screen here. Thank you for arguing week 4. Remember, you have a philosopher portrait for Descartes. So his main sort of contribution, we hear it as a cliche, I think, therefore I am. It's a little bit of a mistranslation. I suggested that on Monday. Also, your argue it out that I want to start with on Monday as well is on the nature of violence, culture, and identity. So you need to decide on a thesis or a topic, extract from one of those problems of knowledge a real-life issue to discuss, take a position on, and go through that Toulmin model of argument that's in your notes. You notice at the top, then again, Team 1 has Chapter 1, Team 2, Chapter 2, etc. You feel free to use whatever chapter you want to supplement your thoughts on the topic. If you're interested in argument, if you're interested in being a lawyer and all this kind of stuff, this might be for you if you enjoy English as well. So again, some of the background info, some of the vocabulary you might need to know in order to establish some divisions in the way we make knowledge claims as a form of argument or persuasion is this idea of objectivity versus subjectivity. What kind of claim do people make? It usually will fall into 2 different categories. And it's important to keep people familiar and aware of how they're using these terms, and also whether or not they're overemphasizing one part of the term, subjectivity or objectivity, versus the other. Are they in a balance with each other, or is it mostly a subjective claim or mostly an objective claim? And I'll tell you why they're both are sort of equal in importance in a second if they're made together. Now, objectivity is existing outside of me, and it represents the way things really are. For instance, an example would be insulin is a hormone needed for energy. There's a chemical basis for insulin. There's an observation, so it corresponds to reality, as one of our true theories lets us know, kind of a presupposition. And as a result, the claim that insulin is a hormone needed for energy is objective. That is, it is a piece of data that doesn't change whether I believe it or not, and it doesn't change whether I like it or not. So whether I have a preference for insulin or not, I like insulin over something else, it really doesn't change the objectivity of the statement. Now, there's some qualifiers here. I have them written at the bottom there. Notice that being objective is, in fact, different than being absolute. So that's an important term. Something that's absolute is something that might never change. It's like immutable. It also might be that it's always that way, and that it is to the nth degree of whatever the concept is. That, for instance, absolute in this case would be like insulin that never changes, or that insulin that is sort of static in that regard. It's certainly not absolute, meaning if I were to believe that a certain data point exists objectively, that's not to say that it is an absolute claim. That would probably be relegated more to just the laws of logic. It represents the connection between facts and the declaration of those facts. And that's a simple way to describe it. Now, subjectivity is a little bit different. And it's an important category nonetheless, even though it's often used as a derogatory feature of argument. That is, oh, that's just your opinion, or that's just a subjective claim or a relative claim. There's two major categories of subjective truth. Opinions concern personal likes or dislikes, such as I like ice cream, and I do. And objective truth applied to a particular context. So if I were to take the idea of ice cream and apply it to my context, it might be objectively true that, in fact, I like ice cream, but it's not objectively true that ice cream is good. That would be a subjective claim. So subjectivity is important for the application of knowledge inquiry. You've got to apply it to your preferences and what you believe. Remember, justified true belief. The subjective part is how knowledge interacts with your mind. I should say how facts or how data points interact with your mind in order to accomplish knowledge or to create knowledge. So subjectivity is important. Now, you can't just have subjective claims such as I think vanilla is better than chocolate. That would be subjective. I couldn't prove that scientifically, other than that it's true for you. So it might be objectively true that Justin Morris likes vanilla over chocolate ice cream, but subjectively we can say that it is merely a subjective claim. That is, it is of the subject in what his preferences are for a topic. It is not absolute, nor is it objective in the sense that it applies to everyone. So to say that vanilla is better than chocolate is a value judgment. Or that I like ice cream does not correspond to ice cream is objectively good for everyone. Subjectivity is important for application, and if we're to consider subjective truth, we need to make sure we understand it in context to justify true belief. Quick anecdote. Sherlock Holmes, as part of his ability to do inductive reasoning and observation, if I were to ask you right now to look at a wall in your room and look at it for about 20 seconds, you might have seen it before for long periods of time, and if you were to turn around, how many things on that room can you list? In much the same way, Sherlock Holmes asked Watson, how many stairs are there from my flat to the street? Watson, of course, was impressed at his ability to perceive the world so readily and so amazingly. And so Sherlock questioned him about why it is that he does it and Watson doesn't. And of course, Watson didn't know the answer to it. And so Sherlock sort of berates him and says, quite so. You have not observed, and yet you have seen. That is just my point. Now I know that there are 17 steps because I have both seen and observed. And when we're looking at argument, we're trying to both see and observe what other people are saying. And in the sense that just not letting them finish their statement so that I can butt in and tell them my view, but to actually observe what people are saying, and then by default, we're able to kind of control the conversation. We're able to sort of decide where things go. We can ask questions, which don't ever feel like you can't ask too many questions of someone's views or beliefs. And this is an important interaction of knowledge, and really a good way to sharpen each other's abilities or challenge each other's beliefs. That's why we love debate so much. Points and counterpoints, rebuttals and counter-rebuttals, questions and cross-examinations. It's how our justice system works. It's how our peer-reviewed journals work. It's about people questioning each other to develop a consensus model of knowledge. So argument then attempts to convey accurately a series of logical propositions towards a persuasive positioned goal. It's not just mathematical deductions, that's a formal logic, and it really isn't persuasive insofar as you're not including rhetoric and other forms of language and questioning and interaction that is organic in nature, that then convinces people towards your position and creates a consensus. Now remember, TOK arguments, unlike other historical arguments, maybe do a historical debate or an English debate on poetry or something like that, or an art critique, they're not relegated to just a single area of knowing. So what we have to do is we constantly are overlapping all of your understanding of different areas and seeing it from different perspectives as a result. Your internal assessment will be essentially to take a problem of knowledge, kind of like your argue it out, and extract the universal concepts and then be able to apply them after looking at them from one real-life situation, to apply them to several other real-life situations. also take into consideration how those areas overlap with other areas and other perspectives. You're meant to take a side approach to observe the world through a TOK lens as opposed to being in the debate itself. You're to step back or step to the side or go to the TOK world, however you want to imagine it. It is a sideline type argument looking at the epistemology. And that's what philosophy is about, looking at different perspectives without necessarily taking on any one of those things for yourself yet. Now you can take on all sorts of beliefs afterwards, but we stop there for the sake of philosophy and move to belief later. Now, to formally introduce Toulmin model of arguments, you can look it up yourself. Please do, so that you know exactly what I'm talking about. But this is essentially what a debate looks like. It's a claim, which is a position towards your argument, and it allows for a conclusion. You also need grounds for your debate. It's sort of like a concrete detail in a commentary, or a concrete detail and the evidence behind the concrete detail, citation, something like that. The grounds are then to your claim or the reasons supporting your evidence. Where do those come from? Usually EBSCO-host or peer-reviewed journals or other types of data points. Warrant is sort of like I use it as almost like a counterexample that you warrant, that you allow for. It might mean that you can't prove something ultimately, like a principle that you can't prove, which we all base our claims ultimately on. So you give a warrant to, granted, I grant these things are true, therefore my position, my claim can be true. And so identifying the grounds by which, or excuse me, the warranting elements of your debate or your argument is important. Your backing would be something like a support, justification, or reason to back up the warrant. So why is it that the warrant is true? Why are you assuming that is true? You might need to add additional information. You also give out the full rebuttal. Well, some people say this, and it's a disagreement. These are exceptions to the claim, or descriptions of the rebuttal and counterexamples, counter-arguments. And then you qualify those counter-arguments to limit your claim and to describe sort of a synthesis of the two approaches. So granted, I can't account for all these things, so this is definitely a weakness in my area, but I think my area still holds water, and that's why I'm keeping it as a claim. It could be in the middle of your Toulmin model of argument for a position that you've taken, that you switch positions. And then at that point, your claim becomes your counterclaim and vice versa. And that's okay to do. You should be able to change your mind, and that's part of the nature of knowledge. So that's the Toulmin model of argument. Ultimately, what the Toulmin model of argument does is, like our stereotypes, it allows us to change what we think we know about something and make true generalities based on the things we know. So it moves from generalizations or hypothesis, kind of like a scientific method of language or rhetoric, takes it and connects it to analogy, something that's similar to it, identifies signs or symbols or things that then give us a concrete element to work with. It identifies causality and maybe establishes that causality works. It might show us an authority, and then eventually we can get a principle of that. So I understand that there's certain people that can make better judgments than me, that's the authority, and that my generalities eventually become principles to work through. And this is how consensus knowledge kind of works, when people work together to build something, which happens through argument. If an argument is based just on generalization, it seems something like a common form of reasoning. It assumes that what is true of a well-chosen sample is likely to hold for a larger group of population. Is it always wrong to stereotype? Might be an interesting question, given the fact that we do it all the time, and that it is somewhat functional and pragmatic for us to make these kinds of patterns work in the world. So certain things seem to be consistent with a sample, and then we can infer those to a group population. If an argument then is based also on an analogy, or only on analogy, I might be able to extrapolate from one situation or event and connect it to another. And this is sort of a case-based and there's precedent-based reasoning used in legal discourse. When you take an analogy, you say, suppose this might happen, how would that change the debate, or how would that reinforce my claim? These are very important elements to establish a principle between two contexts through similarity. So then we're wondering if it's accurate, sufficient, and typical to do these kinds of similarities. If I'm arguing via sign or clue, I might talk about the notion of certain types of evidence, and that those evidences are symptomatic of a wider principle or outcome. I'm looking at just clues and facts like Sherlock Holmes and inferring some basic principles. For instance, smoke is often considered a sign for fire, and so I can argue that because of I'm seeing smoke, I might be able to infer an argument that there is fire nearby. Some people think that high SAT scores are a sign of a person who is smart and will do well in college. That might be an argument I make for myself if I am doing well on SAT scores. It's a sign or a clue in an argument. Causal arguments are occurrences or events that result of or are affected by factors in the world. Causal reasoning is sort of like it's actually the most complex because it requires lots of data and it requires clear connections. Sometimes we make correlation when in fact we make causations when in fact we should be talking about correlation. So you can see that picture there, that Wii controller just kind of flew right into the TV, and that just because it happens to be there and he's in the moment or whatever playing the game, that correlation does not imply causation. That is, we see the two are correlated, but we actually didn't witness the occurrence of causation. So it's important to establish causes, but sometimes it's very difficult to establish why something affects another thing. Sometimes we do mix these two up, correlation and causation. And then there's also that informal fallacy, remember the post hoc fallacy, just because something happens after something else, all of a sudden we can't say that one causes the other. That's called a post hoc, ergo propter hoc. It's because of this, therefore, or this happened, therefore because of this other thing. It's an informal fallacy. And it is related to confusing correlation with causation. If I were to argue from authority, there's good authorities and bad authorities. So if I were to say that 99% of scientists who view climate change as part of their sciences, as part of their expertise, say that climate change happens, this might be an argument from authority, and you can challenge and discuss the counter rebuttals about the effectiveness of that kind of argumentation. But it would be a much different argument than to say something like, Michael Jordan says that climate change is important, I should value it. That would then be a bad form, an informal fallacy of arguing from authority. But arguing from authority inherently isn't bad if the authorities are well established. Remember, this is part of the Toulmin model. If the person is an expert, then you should listen to them. Kind of like you listen to your doctor when you go to the hospital. Of course, there's all sorts of issues of bias and interest. Those are things to consider to limit or to counter something like an argument from authority. To take principles based on various skills. These are how you establish areas of knowing, essentially. You can see in that modeling there how these areas of ethics and values, how skills in certain real-world problems, all these different ways in which we interact with each other can kind of come together as a single learner. This is one such way of doing this: social relevance, real-world problem-solving, diversity, interest, stewardship of the planet or whatever, professional ethics. We create principles that then combine together to create a single argument or single entity. So it's important to locate principles that are widely regarded as valid and showing that a situation exists in which the principle applies. These might be evaluation questions, like, is the principle widely accepted? Does it accurately apply to the situation in question? Are there commonly agreed on exceptions? Are there rival principles that lead to a different claim? And are there practical consequences of following the principle sufficiently desired? When we're looking at gun violence, for instance, principles involved would be like the nature of self-defense, the nature of gun ownership or constitutionality, and how far it expands into our personal lives and our freedoms. Freedom itself is a principle. So these are questions, arguments based on higher things that are usually conceptual frameworks. We all know what a counter-argument is, dealing with counter-arguments and objections. You have to do this to build your argument. There are reasons for doing this so that you're aware of the opposing view, you're thinking carefully, and you're clarifying your own position. When you approach a countering claim, you can do it several ways. You can make a strategic concession. So there's 3 ways, actually, that you can do this. Strategic concession, and this is all in the book, by the way. Thank you for arguing. Strategic concessions are acknowledgments of some of the merits of a different view. say, I like what you're saying here, I do agree with these things, or I like the way you're saying it, or I understand your hesitation with things. But you can always reject parts of a claim. Don't ever think that you have to get stuck in your position and therefore never concede any of your points. It's fine to throw out too much and then concede a little bit. It makes, not only is it an accurate and honest way to debate, but it's also a rhetorical device. It's a form of pathos. You can show an ethos too. You can show that you're detached, you can show that you're looking at it objectively, and then you can persuade people because it sounds like you are reasonable, which is got its own connotation, doesn't it? Beyond just formal logic. If I'm reasonable, it means I'm listening to people. It means I care about the subject. It means I want to show that I am interested in truth, not just being right. Number 2 is refutation. This involves being able to show important weaknesses and shortcomings in the opponent's position. So I can do refutation of a counterclaim. This is one way I can counter a counter, is to say, well, look, let me ask you some questions, and you might demonstrate that the person, in fact, is wrong or unjustified in their counterclaim. You might even just do the informal fallacies. Maybe there's something irrelevant to the way that they said it. Maybe they committed a ad hominem or some other type of post hoc or other informal fallacy, in which case you can call those things out in a way that is respectful, obviously. Don't just list all of those things. Take maybe 2 or 3 things if they have lots of fallacious argument, and talk about those, explain them. You'll be a lot stronger for it in the next round of whatever debate or conversation points you have with the person. And so that concludes what I was going to